Okay, well, welcome everybody. Happy almost Purim and happy almost Shabbat. I appreciate people being here on a Friday afternoon. Thank you for understanding about the whole jury duty thing. So I wanted to talk as much as I can about the book of Esther, and really the sort of subtitle to this class is the canceling of the book of Esther, a tale of three approaches. And I want to sort of start off from a wider framework of Purim in general. Just a 2-minute summary for those who need their yearly reminder of what the holiday of Purim is. So Purim is a single day on the Jewish calendar every year. It's in the middle of the month of Adar, and it's sort of seen as the Jewish day of anything goes, carnival, drinking, Purim spiel. And Purim on the Jewish calendar is basically a day where the normal rules of Jewish community cease to function. And this turns out to have been a problem, right? Purim's always been somewhat problematic in the Jewish community, and it's always been sort of a holiday that many leaders of the Jewish community have had a lot of trouble with, which makes sense, right? Because Purim is, I mean, I remember this firsthand, the community that I grew up in, right? There's obviously, a lot of, hierarchy and respect for the rabbi, and then Purim is the one day a year where you have, the Purim spiel and basically, family after family getting up there and making jokes about how the rabbi sermon goes on forever and is boring. And then, the day after Purim, everybody's, back to their, extreme disposition of respect. And so Purim has always been, right, just to sort of frame this, always been the day on the calendar where the normal rules of society seeks to function. There's been a lot of interesting scholarship connecting it to, say, carnival traditions, where again, you sort of have this day of lawlessness. But I wanted to get at this from just the book of Esther. So I want to share my screen and hopefully just to whet people's appetite and just give one preliminary source about the craziness of Purim. And this is one of my favorite sources, might be familiar to some of you, especially for the college students in the audience. It's always a helpful reminder about the dangers of alcohol. But famously, the Talmud codifies Purim as a day of drunkenness. And so we learn, and this is sort of a famous or infamous piece of Talmud here, that Rabbi tells us, right, Rabbi was a Babylonian sage, that a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until he is so intoxicated that he does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And so the Talmud already tells us that on Purim, you're supposed to get to a level of drunkenness that you don't know that up is up and down is down, right? You mix up your best friend for your worst enemy and vice versa. And so already we're getting this picture of sort of the lawlessness of Purim. And then immediately after, the rabbis give a story basically highlighting the fact that this is actually a terrible idea. And so this is, one of the funnier stories in the Talmud, which is why I brought it. So the Gemara relates that Rabbi and Rabbi Zera prepared a Purim feast with each other, and they became intoxicated to the point that Rabbi arose and slaughtered Rabbi Zera. So the next story in the Talmud that we learn is immediately two rabbis that actually tried to have this party. I see a couple of people looking in utter disbelief at this. And right, became intoxicated to the point where one of the rabbis actually got up and slaughtered the other one. Again, whether or not this is meant to be literal history or metaphor, right, that is a question to figure out at home. But then what happened? So the next day when he became sober and realized what he had done, Rabbi asked God for mercy and revived him, right? So no rabbis harmed in the making of this story, right? The next day, everything's good. So here's the comedic kicker. So the next year, Rabbi said to Rabbi Zera, let the master come and let us prepare the Purim feast with each other. So he asked him, are you interested in round two? And he said to him, miracles do not happen each and every hour. And I don't want to undergo that experience again, right? So very much saying, thank you, but no thank you, right? I'm going to go with the Purim Suda or Purim feast where I don't end up getting slaughtered and have to be revived. And so, of course, this is not supposed to be literal history as the Talmud seldom is, right? This is, of course, a comedic glimpse, and I think actually a very interesting warning from the Talmud about the potential dangers of alcoholism, which can be a whole other class and discussion in and of itself. But this is all to say that the Jewish community, and especially the rabbis, and when I say the rabbis, I mean Jewish community leaders over the years, have always had a little bit of discomfort when it comes to Purim. And there's always been sort of two minds. One, that Purim is a day of a lot of fun. And two, that this type of partying and this type of day where all the normal rules of society don't function can also lead to a lot of very dire circumstances. And so this is just sort of as a general framework to understanding. Then when we get to the book of Esther, so I want to go over two just preliminary sources to set up the problem. Then we'll have a conversation, and then I will, as promised, give three different approaches, as we set up here, as to how the book of Esther has attempted to be either canceled, edited, or, as we know in the Jewish community today, loved and cherished. And so we'll do what I call inklings of a problem, and then we can have a little bit of conversation and see some thoughts. So we're going to work a little bit backwards in time, because again, we're going to start in the Talmud. And just for review, the Talmud mostly was written between the 4th and 6th century CE. So now this is about 1,000 years after the Purim story happens. But the rabbis are already a little bit uncomfortable, and they're almost putting words in Esther's mouth. And we can read this source, and we'll see why this sort of gets us at a glimpse that already the book of Esther was seen by the rabbis as being somewhat problematic. So I'll read the source, and then we can discuss a little bit of background. So Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda said, Esther told the sages, establish me for future generations. So this is a conversation of Esther presumably happening after the Purim story, and just a little summary of the Purim story. I'm going to guess most people here have a high level of familiarity with the book of Esther, but just a very basic summary is that the book of Esther is a book set in ancient Persia, and you have a Jewish community there that is most likely during the exile. So this is after the first temple was destroyed, while the entire Jewish community was moved over to Babylonia, and after the Persian Empire took over. All of a sudden we get a king who is either a fool or evil, depending on how you want to read him, Ahasuerus, who was convinced by his actual evil advisor Haman or Haman to issue a genocidal decree against the Jews. And the entire book of Esther is about a heroine named Esther who ends up becoming Ahasuerus' wife, and about her uncle, right? It's unclear exactly what the relationship is, a man named Mordechai who's sort of helping her from the outside. And through a bunch of clever political maneuvering and some comedic relief, how Esther and Mordechai come in and save the day. And in the end, everything gets flipped on its head. And so Haman prepared these gallows to hang the Jews. In the end, Haman gets hung, right? The people of Shushan, which was a city in ancient Persia, they are going to go through the streets and kill the Jews. At the end of the story, the Jews go through the streets and kill the Shushanites. And so the Purim story ends up, everything gets flipped on its head. And so this story in the Talmud is presumably what happens right after the story, right? And so Rabbi Shmuel is telling us that Esther was telling the rabbis, this is a pretty great story, right? In Judaism, when we have pretty great stories, we like to ritualize it in a way, right? We can even think more recently, right? Perhaps the most recent Jewish holiday, or one of the most recent Jewish holidays, say, is Yom HaAtzmaut, right? Yom HaAtzmaut commemorates the founding of the state of Israel. So that means a group of people, or the Jewish community, had to, in 1948, or some of the years after, decide that this is a day worth commemorating. And once it's a day worth commemorating, all of a sudden, great, then you come up with rituals, you come up with things. And so Esther is now trying to make the same case. The rabbis at the time of Esther immediately say to her, you will thereby arouse the wrath of the nations against us, as the Megillah recounts the victory of the Jews over Gentiles, and it's best not to publicize that victory. So the rabbis at the time are telling Esther, it's really cute that you think this should be a great holiday every year where the Jewish community comes together and reads the story. You're going to get a lot of people mad at us, right? The story doesn't make the Jews seem like the most loyal subjects in an empire, right? This seems like a story of the Jews being, for lack of a better term, inconvenient, and we would rather not publicize the story. And so Esther writes back to them, I'm already written in the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia, and the Megillah will not publicize anything that is not already known worldwide. And so Esther says back, and I'll sort of explain a little bit of the background of this in a second. Esther writes back, don't worry, this already made the front page news in, the Persian Times or whatever people read back then, right? Nobody's going to get, nobody's going to be startled by this story, right? We might as well make it a holiday. But already, right, just from this source, and again, the source is definitely not historical, right? There was no actual conversation between Esther and the sages happening in the 6th century BCE. But already this is the rabbis voicing a concern about this story, right? There's something about this story that's a little off, right? And so we go to our next story about inkling of a problem, and then we can take a step back, and I'm going to put people here to work, and we can come up with some reasons why the story might be problematic. So this next source, and if people are a little lost now, I think you'll start a little bit lost, and then hopefully by the end, everybody will retroactively understand all of this. So the rabbis in another place in the Talmud ask a very strange question, and they want to know, where is Esther indicated in the Torah? Now, anybody who is involved in Jewish scholarship or Jewish community knows that Esther is not in the Torah, right? The Torah starts off with Genesis and ends off before the Israelites even cross into the land of Israel, right? Historically, this is about 800 years before the book of Esther, right? And so already this is a very strange question, right? The correct answer is it's not, right? It's almost as if I asked, where is what I had for dinner tonight in the Torah, right? And so this story is a story that comes about later. And whenever the rabbis want to ask, where is X found in the Torah, it's always polemical. And what I mean by that is the rabbis are attempting to say, there's something in the book of Esther that is not kosher, for lack of a better term. We need to figure out how to read Esther into the Torah to retroactively make it kosher. And here's what the rabbis come up with. The rabbis say, well, Esther's in the Torah in this verse in Deuteronomy, and I will surely hide my face on that day. That teaches that Esther is a manifestation of the divine hiding. So of course we go to our bookshelf, or if we're on the internet, we go to the next tab, which is Sepharia, and we're curious and we say, well, what is this original verse that that the rabbis are quoting here? And this is in a section in the book of Deuteronomy where Moses is basically warning the Israelites that if the Jews or the Israelites are bad, God is going to just unleash the biggest wrath and vengeance you've ever seen on them, right? My anger will flare up against them. I will abandon them. I will hide my countenance from them. They shall be prey, and many evils and troubles shall befall them. They shall say on that day, surely it is because God is not in our midst that evils befall us, right? So the rabbis are saying, well, Moses did warn us. He did warn us that there was going to be a time in history where everything was going to be absolutely terrible. And then here is the language of Deuteronomy here. Ve'anochi hestir estir pani b'yom hazeh. Now, for anybody with a slight knowledge of Hebrew should immediately see the connection, right? Hestir astir is the same word as Esther, right? And actually, if you tackle the etymology of the word Esther, it means a hiding, right? This is actually just a little bit of a tangent. This is why we have a custom of wearing costumes. One of the reasons why on Purim, because the entire meta point of Purim is a hiding, right? Esther hid her identity. And so on Purim, we hide our identities. And so the rabbis are quoting this verse, right? That that when our worst disasters are befalling us, God is going to hide himself on that day because we have been evil. And so back to the Talmud here, right? So the best the rabbis could come up with about this question of where do we find Esther in the Torah is the rabbis say there's going to be times in Jewish history that seem absolutely terrible. You're going to look for God to bail you out, and God is not going to be anywhere to be found, right? God will estir et panai, right? He will hide his face. And where do we know this became true? In the book of Esther or Esther. So the rabbis' only ability to pinpoint the book of Esther in the Talmud when they're trying to figure out, well, where is there a biblical source for this or in a Torah source for this is basically saying, well, there's going to be a day where God is going to abandon us. And Moses warned us about this, and now it's coming true in Esther. So taking a step back, and I want to unshare my screen a little bit, so hopefully we can have some conversation here. If I were to ask, right, so the book of Esther has a number of problems, and we're, again, in a few minutes going to go through 3 of the approaches as to how the ancient community dealt with the problem of the book of Esther. But taking a step back, why is Esther so problematic, right? Open question, right? Unmute yourself, type in the chat, do whatever. And there's no right or wrong answer here.
I'm going
Okay, so she's a woman?
Okay, so wait, who said that? Sorry. Was that Anita? Okay, so we have one opinion, which you are right, and we'll see one way in which that actually manifests later, right? Perhaps the problem of the book of Esther is that Esther is a female heroine. And if you read a lot of the sort of macho-y books of the Tanakh, right, it seems like there almost always are male leaders, right? The one notable exception is Deborah, the judge, who is, a female leader. But yes, right, obviously the Tanakh is very male-centric in terms of its heroism. So perhaps, right, you can imagine later, mostly male or all male leaders of the Jewish community taking a step back and saying, we feel really uncomfortable with this, superwoman type story, right? Perhaps that is a controversy of Esther. Ethan, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so I'm working off of a not perfect memory of the details of the story, but isn't there kind of potential reading that they're sacrificing Esther potentially to save the rest of the Jewish people? Could that be a potential reading of it?
Okay, so perhaps, and there was actually a really funny, there's an Israeli comedy show called Hayehudim Ba'im, or the Jews Are Coming, that likes to make fun of short episodes of Jewish history. And one of the comedy bits that it makes fun of is actually this exact sort of offering of Esther, right? It's, you have God issuing the 10 commandments, and God says, thou shalt not commit adultery. And somebody says, well, what about Esther? And they keep on asking. So from some Jewish ethics centric view, it could be problematic. I like it. I see somebody put in the chat, Barbara says that God is not mentioned, and we do violence at the end. And so Barbara is spot on with both of those, right? The most glaring omission of the book of Esther is that there is no God, right? And this is the only book of the Tanakh in which God is not mentioned. And right, this of course seems problematic, because if you're used to sort of your normal biblical literature, right? If you think right now in terms of our weekly Parshiot, we're in the book of Exodus, but it doesn't matter where you turn, right? If somebody takes a Bible, right? I was prepping earlier today. If you take a Bible and you open it to a random page, the most common character will be God, right? God said, God did, God led, God got, God all these things. And if you read the 10 chapters of the book of Esther, right, there is no God, right? And it's a glaring omission. And then also at the end, Barbara says, right, there is violence, right? There's a proliferation of violence from the Jewish community. And that seems like what the Talmud was getting at, where they said, well, maybe we shouldn't, be sort of wearing the story on our sleeve, right? It might give people the wrong impression of us. Okay, any other thoughts about the problematic nature of the book of Esther? Perfect. Okay, so we can go back to our, so Ethan says it reminds me of the codification of the Hanukkah story. So I like that, and maybe we'll return to Hanukkah a little bit later. So I think you guys got all four of the things that I had already written down before. So congrats. So right, the first main problem, of course, is that there's no God. We talked about that. The second, it should just be a subcategory, but there's no religion in general, right? Meaning, if we imagine, right, Jewish law being, all encompassing, right? One of the most glaring things about the book of Esther is that there's seemingly no Jewish practice, right? One of the most explicit manifestations in that is, say, the feast that the Jews go to at the beginning, right? There's no mention of kosher. Jews are drinking the wine of Achashverosh, right? It just seems in general, it reads like a very secular book, right? The third one was the female lead. And fourth, right, this might sound vague, but just the general nature of Esther makes it seem as if you are not reading a deeply religious book, right? If somebody were to pick up Esther, you might conclude that Esther is either a very interesting ancient political story, or maybe Esther is political satire, or maybe Esther, as some scholars want to argue, was actually an early attempt at a play, right? Maybe where we get the tradition of doing a Purim spiel. But the book of Esther does not read, again, like a deeply religious text, right? There's very little religious inspiration to gain from the book of Esther, according to one view of religion, right? Which we'll get to in the beginning. So now we can get to some approaches as to how ancient Jewish communities wanted to deal with this. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting aspects that happened in the 3rd century BCE Jewish community. So I want to introduce everybody who hasn't heard, right? The first translation of the Torah, or of the entire Tanakh, was called the Septuagint. And just a 2-minute review as to what that was, right? So in the year 333 BCE, Alexander the Great comes through the Middle East and he takes over the land of Israel. And of course, most, if not all, the Jews in the world find themselves under Greek rule, right? And all of a sudden, Greek culture is starting to infuse more and more into the daily life of the Jewish people, right? We have all heard of the Hanukkah story, right? Which Ethan alluded to before, which is a chief manifestation of the Hellenist versus traditional Jewish clash. And all of a sudden, just like today, if we were to print a new edition of the Torah with a translation, it would have to be in English, because most Jews in America are both American and Jewish at the same time. And by that, I mean, right, we speak English, but we're also in the Jewish community, right? Back then, there were a lot of Jews who were Greek and Jewish also at the same time, which meant that their first language was no longer Hebrew or Aramaic. It was, as American Jews are today, your first language growing up in America is English. And so if you want to produce Jewish content for young or even older American Jews to understand, it doesn't help if I write the most beautiful article or persuasive essay in Hebrew. Very few people in the American Jewish community can understand that. So I would write it in English. And so this is exactly what the Septuagint was. It was a group of Jewish leaders that came together to translate the Torah into Greek. Now, the vast majority of the time, they do a very good job. All right, I've never studied Greek, but from what I've read, right, most of their early translation of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus is pretty spot on, right? There are some times where Septuagint seems to argue with, basic biblical Hebrew, but then all of a sudden we get to the book of Esther. And what the Septuagint does to the book of Esther is absolutely fascinating. So rather than give you the general view of what it does to Esther, I wanted to actually go to one or two examples of what the Septuagint does to Esther. So right in the middle of the book of Esther, and this is the Septuagint then translated into English. This is right after the famous scene in the book of Esther when Mordecai and Esther are talking and they say, what should we do? And in the original version, Mordecai says, well, Esther, you're going to need to step up and save the Jews. Here's what the Septuagint says. Then Mordecai prayed to the Lord, calling him to remember all the works of the Lord. He said, O Lord, Lord, you rule as king over all things, for the universe is in your power, and there is no one who can oppose you when it is your will to save Israel. For you have made heaven and earth and every wonderful thing under heaven. You are Lord of all, and there is no one who can resist you, the Lord. You know all things, you know, O Lord, that it was not in insolence or pride or for any love of glory that I did this and refused to bow down to proud Haman. For I would have been willing to kiss the soles of his feet to save Israel. But I did this so that I might not set human glory above the glory of the Lord. And I will not bow down to anybody but you, who are my Lord. And I will not do these things in pride. And now, O Lord, God and King, God of Abraham, spare your people, for the eyes of our foes are upon us to annihilate us. And they desire to destroy the inheritance that has been yours from the beginning. Do not neglect your portion, which you have redeemed out of the land of Israel. Hear my prayer, and have mercy upon your inheritance. Turn our mourning into feasting, that we may live and sing praise in your name. O Lord, do not destroy the lips of those who praise you. And all of Israel cried out mightily, for their death was before their eyes. So now we're all sitting here thinking, where did this come from? Right? This reads to some extent like the first time I read this a couple of years ago, I picture the kid that's sitting in a class that's worried they're going to get a failing grade. And so they have to go up to the teacher and basically say, oh, teacher, my master, right? You who are in charge of all things, right? I don't think there's any biblical text that mentions God and God's glory and God's kingdom and God and Lord so many times. I mean, this is a fascinating addition, because this is basically attempting to say, well, you might think that Mordecai just went in there and said, you know what, me and Esther have to save the day. The interpretation of the Septuagint comes in and adds God everywhere. And so, right, we have this handy dandy sheet on Sepharia that I didn't prepare, but just an overview, right? If we were to actually analyze the main differences between the book of Esther in the Septuagint and the original version, and right, this is also in the normal study Bible for those who are wondering, right? That in the additional edition, right, we already know all of this, right? In the apocryphal edition, and again, 3rd century BCE. This is not, a group that this is not a bunch of Haredi Jews that translated this, 3 weeks ago in Borough Park, right? So the apocryphal editions are, God is mentioned over 50 times in the text, right? It's probably even more than 50 if we were to actually count. Emphasis is placed on the religious nature of the characters, right? All of a sudden, Mordecai goes from what I could imagine to be a mostly secular Jew to Mordecai is now the most religious, most traditional, frum person we've ever met. Another edition, right? We don't exactly have time to go through this, but I can send everybody the link here. It explicitly mentions that Esther keeps kosher the whole time. And so it's a fascinating addition of every time Esther is in the palace, she's going through and Esther specifically got the food which was kosher, and she, did X, Y, and Z to make sure. Esther is weakified. I don't know if weakified is a word, but a lot of the feminine power of Esther is removed, right? Nodding to the point before that the Septuagint was also uncomfortable with a strong female lead, and Esther is removed from being the hero, and God is now the hero. And so we take a step back and we try to figure out, okay, this is probably the first and most audacious Jewish messing with history. I don't even know what to call it, right? Translation, but also interpretation. A couple interesting things to note, and then we could talk about the historical background. So today, in a lot of Catholic communities, it's actually a big debate between a lot of Catholic communities and Protestants. This version of Esther is still read. And so if you actually go to certain Catholic churches and you do Bible study, you're reading this version of Esther. And presumably this was the case if we hopped in a time machine and went back 2,200 years and we found ourselves in Jerusalem or in Alexandria, Egypt, and we were looking for a synagogue to pray in on Purim, right? It might be the case that the majority of synagogues that we would end up in would be reading this version. And so we take a step back and we sort of remember, I know it was a couple months ago, but the sort of meta story of what happened with Hanukkah, right? Hanukkah is a little bit unique in terms of the historical tensions, because in Hanukkah, if we remember, it was the first time that Judaism was under attack, but Jews were safe, right? What do I mean by that? Well, all other times in our history where people wanted to annihilate and attack Jews, right? Think Pharaoh, think Amalek, think the Canaanites, think the Purim story. This was an attack on Jews. All of a sudden, the Hellenists, right? They liked Jews as long as they weren't Jewish. And so we start to see an attack on Judaism as a religious tradition, as opposed to Jews as a people. And so if you're the leader of the Jewish community and you are trying to inculcate group or cultural values into a religious story, it's not enough that you want to highlight the people of Israel or the Jews, you have to highlight Judaism. And this is actually the dominant scholarly view as to what the heck was happening in the Septuagint, was a lot of Jewish leaders saw this book and they were afraid, well, if I give this book to the community, if I show up to synagogue on Monday night or Tuesday and I read the actual book of Esther, and let's say that Henry happens to be sitting in the audience and Henry listens to the book of Esther and Henry, understands the entire story, and Henry says, great, I can be a Jew, right? I identify with the Jews in the story, and I also can adopt Greek cultural Hellenistic values because there's nothing religious that binds me as a Jew, right? This is a secular story about Jewish peoplehood. And so the rabbis at the time, or the leaders of the Jewish community, said, well, not so fast, right? We can't just have all of the Jews reading this seemingly secular story of Esther, we need to sort of infuse God and religion to it so that they have to know that they can't take in Greek and Hellenistic views into Judaism. So this is the Septuagint version. So this is a tale of one approach. So what do you do when you are faced with the book of Esther? And I'll take a moment for questions and comments for a second. This is one approach which we can deem the heavily edited approach, right? What happens in Judaism when we confront a problematic text, or what does a Jewish community do with a book of Esther that seems radically secular, right? You edit it. You say, well, this was never meant to actually be a secular book. Really, God was missing and we found him and put him back in. Okay, taking a step back, let's see some questions. Ethan wrote in the chat, when you say they read this version, are you referring to which version? So back in the 3rd century, I believe the Septuagint version would have been the mainstream version that was read, especially in more intellectually elite Jewish circles. And today, in many Catholic sects, this is the version that's read. Sydney, go for it.
I think in more recent prayer books, they have changed the translations of prayers in English because certain things the Reform movement thought, well, we're a little uncomfortable with it. So sometimes they just cut it out, like the second paragraph of the Via Hopta, but sometimes they just translate it. Oh, these, dumb Reform Jews, they won't know the difference anyway.
I think to some extent you're right in terms of what the leaders were doing thousands of years ago, meaning this was at a time when, and it's totally understandable, right, that your average Jew living in Alexandria did not speak Hebrew, right? First, they would have spoken probably Greek. Second, if they had a second language, it would probably be Aramaic, right? I mean, biblical Hebrew hadn't been spoken in hundreds of years. And so just like today, I mean, there are lots of Jewish sources that are written in dense ancient Hebrew that, very few Jews today understand. I mean, even if Jews today can understand the Torah and maybe some early rabbinic works, I mean, I can't open medieval Hebrew poetry and understand what the heck is going on, right? And so you can imagine, right, that it was a very similar situation. And so there was a little bit of a bait and switch going on, which is, well, here's your translation, right? This actually happens a lot. One time when I see this a lot, this is just an interesting sociological observation. And then Fred, I'll take your question. If anybody ever reads the original text of the Ketubah, right, the Jewish marriage document, and obviously, in different movements, they've updated it, but the actual language of the original Ketubah is a purchasing contract. It says, I am giving X amount of money, and you're quote unquote buying the wife, right? This is a 2,000-year-old legal document. And I've been at hundreds of weddings before where they've read the Ketubah in Aramaic. It's been the original textual version. And so they're saying basically, Mark agrees to pay X amount of money to buy blah, blah, blah. And then the rabbi says, this text is a beautiful discussion about love, and it's talking about the bond and everlasting love in which they have for each other. And everybody sits there nodding and is, wow, this is so amazing. And the 3 people who know what a ketubah actually says are sitting there like, what is going on? Fred, what were you going to say?
I really need clarification. And I probably missed something that you said because I didn't hear so well because Cindy had the microphone on in another part of the room. But we're saying the Septuagint. So we have the version of the Septuagint was written, and that means there must be a version of the Megillah that we know is older than that. All right. Okay. And I didn't know, is there? Because how do we know which came first? I mean, if they wrote this in the 3rd century BCE, maybe this was a translation of, this is where I'm confused then. Is this a translation of some original source that actually had God in it, and then later on they took the God part out? Or do we have versions that are older than the Septuagint? Because I didn't think we had scrolls that were that old of the Megillah. Maybe I'm wrong. Or maybe is it that the discussions in the Talmud that said that Septuagint added this? And I'm just trying, that's my confusion. My confusion is, how do we know which came first? Did the Septuagint come from an original source and then they changed it after that because they didn't like God in it, just like they don't like the word fat in some Roald Dahl's book, which came first? So maybe you could help me with that.
Yeah, it's a really great question. Without going too endlessly down an academic rabbit hole, stop me if we feel like we are descending into that abyss. We do not have a scroll of Esther that predates the Septuagint. So you're right about that. What we do have in terms of scholars dating books and what's original and what's not is a whole series of intricate literary analysis and linguistic analysis, and they find loaner words from other cultures. And so all scholars agree that the original is the text that we have, in the Septuagint was added based off of some words that would have been in vogue in the 4th century that nobody writing in the 2nd century could have known about, and other things like that. And this is actually how, again, without going too far down the rabbit hole, how we date basically all biblical books. We have no actual idea, let's say, when the book of Ecclesiastes was written, right? The Ecclesiastes seems like it's internally attributed to King Solomon, right? It's almost certainly not written by King Solomon, right? When was it written? Well, it seems to have a lot of Greek ideas, and it sort of uses, it accidentally slips in 1 or 2 Aramaic words. So that means it obviously had to have been written after Aramaic was invented, right? So there's all these different ways. But the short of it is we do know for sure, even though nobody's ever found a scroll of Esther dated to the 5th century, we do know that it was written before the Septuagint. But it is a great question. Any other thoughts or questions here before we move on? We still have two more approaches here, but I think we are doing well on time. And I think I see one more comment. So I'm reading Maddie's question here. Maddie, do you mind asking your question?
Yeah. No, because I was just looking at the Megillah, and it seems to like highlight, if not like, it still celebrates her, but it celebrates her as a product of diaspora. And to kind of like, I don't know what I'm thinking. But not that it's like making her, just like the insertion of prayer and stuff, like because she does fast, doesn't she, in the Megillah, but it's not related to prayer.
Yeah,
so there's like some knowledge but not religious knowledge, which seems to be related to her position as a product of diaspora. And so is there a reason that they would want to like take that away, I guess?
I think I see what you mean. I guess your question is getting at this age-old tension of what are Jews, right? Are Jews a religion or a people? And this is the tension in the book of the Megillah, and this is sort of where we're gonna conclude today. So I don't want to hop the gun too much, but that is the exact problem, meaning the Septuagint is trying to argue for Jews are a religious community that have to hold by religious values. What's a religious value? Well, it means you better pray, you better believe in God, you better think God orchestrates everything in the universe, and that is the way to be Jewish. And it seems like the original version of the Megillat Esther doesn't prescribe a right way to be Jewish, which might have been problematic to later thinkers that want to say, no, the way to be Jewish is if tragedy befalls you, for you to sit around praying, as opposed to, say, political action. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So I want to go through a little bit more history, but that was a good observation, Maddie. Okay, so let's travel forward a little bit to a city called Qumran. So I feel like we're going on a little Israel historical tour here. So the city of Qumran is in the north of the Dead Sea, and I'll explain why this is important in a second, right? It is just east of Jerusalem, so it's the closest place to the Dead Sea from Jerusalem. And the reason why Qumran ended up becoming one of the most important ancient Jewish historical places is because in the year 1948, the story goes, I don't know how much of this is apocryphal and how much of the story is true, but supposedly an Arab shepherd was leading a flock in the Judean mountains by the north of the Dead Sea, and he was throwing rocks, and all of a sudden one of the rocks hops into a cave and he hears pottery shattering, and interested, he goes into one of the caves and finds all of these things of pottery and opens them and just finds an entire trough of scrolls. And so he quickly, ends up, I think he ends up selling them for a very low amount of money. But these end up being obviously tackled by scholars, and they became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I would imagine is somewhat familiar to people here. And what the Dead Sea Scrolls ended up being is, to Fred's point before, the Dead Sea Scrolls do two important things. The Dead Sea Scrolls, one, are the oldest actual copies of all the biblical texts that we have. And so if anybody ever asks you, well, where in history do we know we have the first full account of the book of Joshua, right? So the book of Joshua is obviously older than the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are dated to the 1st century BCE. But the first time we actually have a copy of the full book of Joshua, right, that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The second reason why they were important is that the Dead Sea Scrolls end up giving us a ton of information about what the Jewish community in the 1st century was. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So we go to Josephus, who was a historian at the time, and Josephus tells us about the identity of this strange community that was living in Qumran. Because again, this was still at a time when the temple was in activity, right? This is late Second Temple period. And so Josephus tells us, I'm going to ask, I think I'm hearing some background noise. I don't know if anybody's unmuted here. Perfect. Okay. So Josephus tells us, and this paints a little bit of a sociological picture among the Jewish community in the Second Temple. So he tells us there were 3 philosophical sects among the Jews. The first are Pharisees, second Sadducees, and the third sect, which pretends to a severer discipline, are called the Essenes. And so virtually all scholars say these Dead Sea Scrolls were written by the Essenes. These last are Jews by birth. So what does that mean? That means they did not allow people to convert. They seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have, right? So they're very insular. These Essenes reject pleasure as an evil, but esteem continence and the conquest over our passions to be virtue, right? So these Essenes, right, they would not be a lot of fun at parties, right? They think that any pleasure is absolutely terrible, right? They neglect wedlock, right? So actually, my favorite academic theory as to why the Essenes ended up dying out was because one academic suggests they ended up getting so extreme that none of them got married and had children, which is obviously not a great way to prepare the next generation. They neglect wedlock, but choose out other person's children while they are pliable and fit for learning and esteemed to be of their kindred, and form them according to their own manners. And so they, on average, don't have children, but they try to go to main Jewish cities and, I don't want to say take, but convince young children to come study in their schools and convince them in their ways. They do not absolutely deny the fitness of marriage and the succession of mankind thereby continued, but they guard against the lascivious behavior of women and are persuaded that none of them preserve the fidelity to one man. These men, just to read a little bit more, to paint a picture of this ascetic group, these men are despisers of riches, and so very communicative, as raises our admiration, nor is there anyone to be found among them who has more than another, for it is a law among them that those who come to them must let what they have be common to the whole order, insomuch that among them there is no appearance of poverty or excess of riches, but everyone's possessions are intermingled with everyone else's possessions, and so there is, as it were, one patrimony among all the brethren, right? So not only is this a fundamentalist, insular, religious group, they're also apparently worked out socialism, right? They think that oil is a defilement, and that if anyone were to be anointed without his own approbation, it is wiped off his body, for they think to be sweaty is a good thing, as they do also to be clothed in white garments. They also have stewards appointed to take care of their common affairs, who every one of them has no separate business for any, but what is for the uses of all of them, right? So again, sounds like a not a group that you would want to be, good friends with. But it turns out, right, so if we do a little bit more historical digging, and Josephus gets into this, and we find this out from actually reading a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were unique to the sect, that at a certain point in the late Second Temple, they began, as a lot of people did, by the way, it was the same with the Pharisees, they began to think that the life around the Jerusalem temple was getting increasingly corrupt, and that the priests were enriching themselves on behalf of the populace, right? A story that we've all heard before. And so they decided that they were going to move out to the desert and start their own community and their own way of life. There's actually one interesting scholarly opinion, this is a minor tangent, that the Essenes were what inspired early Christians. I don't want to get into that tangent for now, but a quick Google search can bring up some interesting articles about that. But the Essenes end up moving east of Jerusalem to the Dead Sea, and they end up living there for 2 or 3 generations until in 1948, Israeli archaeologists have gone through these caves hundreds of times, and it's probably many careers in archaeology have been funded by the discovery of these scrolls. Now, why are we bringing all this up? Well, it turns out when scholars spent years of their life in these caves, they found dozens of copies of every single book in the Hebrew Bible except for one, right? And we probably know where we're going with this, right? Scholars looked everywhere around Qumran, they dug, and there was no book of Esther. And they look, and interestingly enough, they know that this community knew about Esther, because in some of their other scrolls that are talking about the difference between them and what they call the, corrupt men of darkness in Jerusalem, that's an actual term they use, right? They talk about, and there is an annual holiday where they, and then talk about all the normal Purim things. And so this community did not have the book of Esther. So now, of course, we can get into endlessly scholarly theories as to why, just so I can still argue that my graduate school actually paid off. One of the articles I wrote in graduate school was actually about this topic, right? Why the book of Esther was from the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm happy to post this here if anybody is curious. But what turns out, and there's tons of different scholarly theories as to why the book isn't there, right? Ranging from everything we can probably come up with in our group, right? There's no God, right? The power of woman, all of these things. Ultimately, I think probably all these views are right? This is an extremely ascetic community that seems to hate pleasure and partying and is all about, ritual purity and God. And so the book of Esther would have just seemed totally anathema to anything that that community stood for. And so, if the Septuagint's approach to Esther was to say, this book is problematic, let's edit it out, the Essene community's approach to Esther was to say, this book is problematic, let's just not bring it with us, Let's remove the book of Esther from Tanakh, Let's pretend this day never happened, No such thing as Purim, If anything screams day of pleasure and partying, it is the holiday of Purim. If anything screams, the female power, it is the holiday of Purim, Better just to leave it there, So only because we have 10 minutes left, I want to get to the last part, and then we can have a conversation. I'm always, of course, happy to stay extra. So we get into the Talmud, which was, of course, written a couple hundred years after. And the rabbis in the Talmud seem to still have this debate in the early Talmud. And one of the interesting conversations that the rabbis have, and just a tiny bit of background as to understanding the source, the rabbis issued a decree that any sacred scroll renders your hands impure. To go into why that's the case, I don't want to get into an endless conversation about what purity and impurity means. When somebody says the word impure today, we seem to have a negative connotation. It doesn't seem like in the Talmud, when they said something was impure, they necessarily meant negative, It was a way of constructing boundaries, Similar to if somebody says, I'm trying, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but impure is not necessarily bad, Even though we tend to think of it as. And so eventually the rabbis made a rule, They saw that there were people that were mistreating their sacred scrolls, So if Fred got a new copy of the Book of Kings and Fred was so happy that he got his new book, Fred might, end up leaving his Book of Kings around, and perhaps he leaves it out on his table, and then him and Sydney go home and they have dinner on their table, and they're sort of degrading the scroll, because scrolls are supposed to be kept, in a nice ark in the corner of your house or the synagogue, not on the kitchen table. And so the rabbis decided, well, let's tell everybody that actually this Book of Kings or any of these sacred scrolls renders your hands impure. And if food is rendered impure, well, you're not going to eat impure food. So therefore, holy scrolls are impure, right? There's a lot more there, but that's sort of the basis. And so when it gets to the conversation about the purity or lack thereof of scrolls, Rabbi Yehuda says that Shmuel said that the book of Esther does not render your hands impure. And so apparently this view, right, and what that basically means is the book of Esther is not holy according to Shmuel. And they give us the background, right? Although the sages issued a decree that sacred scrolls render hands ritually impure, the book of Esther was not accorded the sanctity of sacred scrolls. So it seems that there was an ethos, even in the early Talmud, that tried to say that the book of Esther was not holy. But then, and I'm not gonna read this all because I want to have a couple minutes for just closing reflections. The Talmud ends up challenging this opinion and giving about 100 different reasons why the book of Esther actually is a holy book. And so, right, that's this entire source, right? And I will copy this into the chat if anybody actually wants to read through it. I'm just showing you all how long it is and why I'm going to spare you me reading it. But the Talmud ends up rejecting this opinion of Shmuel that the book of Esther is not impure. And I'm going to unshare my screen just to sort of take a step back and frame everything, right? So we had, of course, right, this problematic book that seems to present a hyper-secular view of the Jewish community and of Jewish action. And of course, if you are trying to make the argument that Jews and Judaism are supposed to be doing one thing, right? If your one thing is deep devotion to God, or your one thing is, let's say, living an ascetic lifestyle without pleasure, the book of Esther is going to challenge your presuppositions. Because it turns out that when you actually read through the Tanakh and we go through our yearly calendar, we actually have different approaches as to how Jews have dealt with different things happening, and not all the approaches have to be uniform. And one of the things that the book of Esther teaches is that one way, or a Jewish response to calamity and to destruction and all of these things, is political action. And it is sort of raising the ethos of political action to be a Jewish value, to say that the sort of chief value of the book of Esther is, if something goes wrong, do not wait around for God to come and save you, right? Go out and do something yourself. And so, of course, we can imagine that this was troubling to ancient Jewish communities. I also want to show one more source that I forgot to, just because this is always one of my favorite sources at the end of the Megillah, just to sort of drive this point home. Then we could do some more concluding thoughts. At the very end of the Megillah, and I'll put this in Hebrew also, the last verse of the Megillah says as follows. Ki Mordechai, right, this is after everything is saved and after Mordechai gets appointed to vice king of the land. Ki Mordechai hayudi mishneh lamelech achashverosh, right, and Mordechai the Jew, right, was second in command to the king. The Gadol LaYehudim, right, he was the greatest of the Jews. V'ratzui l'rov achav, right, he was liked by the majority of his people. Right, this is my favorite line in the entirety of the Tanakh, because this is saying, the other way to say this is, this guy just saved the entire Jewish people from a genocidal decree. He's now vice president, and only most of the Jews were happy with him. Right, there were still those other people in the corner that were sitting there grumbling, he could have done it a little better. Right, I'm not so sure this was the right move. Right, what an incredible view. Right, and so the whole book of Esther, to some extent, right, is a meta commentary here, right? And it speaks to, again, the diversity in the Jewish community of theological opinions, of actions, of what we have to do, right? And it speaks to a modern situation where, I don't know about you, but I read the book of Exodus sometimes. And again, it's inspiring. And in a month from now, we'll talk about Passover and all the important lessons to learn from the Exodus. But the Exodus is in some sense a lot more difficult to connect to. Because the last time I checked and the last time I went outside and saw oppression, I didn't see God splitting open oceans and sending down plagues and sending manna from heaven. But what I have seen, right, and what we are familiar with is that working through social action and through political action is, of course, a way to change the status quo and to better society. And so Esther is a much more contemporary book than any of the other books of the Bible. And the beauty of Esther is that I can read the book of Esther and Maddie can read the book of Esther, and we can conclude opposite things. I can read the book of Esther and I could say, listen, maybe I'm personally, or maybe, Sam, right, I'll make up a person, is agnostic as to God's existence. And Sam says, yep, the book of Esther reflects reality, right? Humans have to be the one to better society, right? You can't wait for God to bail you out. Somebody else can read the book of Esther and say, isn't this an incredible story about how God works in mysterious ways behind the scenes? Which is the correct reading? Well, that's the point, right? Life oftentimes is complicated, and going out in the world and seeing events unfold, there isn't a clear answer as to whether or not was that all theologically or divinely ordained, or was that all a seeming set of random occurrences that were inspired by human action. And so the book of Esther represents a modern view of Judaism, where there's not necessarily one right way. And when, right, probably the best example of this, I know I keep harping to 1948, but I think it's a good comparison, right? Was the return to the land of Israel due to savvy political maneuvering by Jewish community leaders, or God redeeming the Israelites and bringing them back to the promised land, right? And two different people can view the same situation and come up with two different conclusions. And which one is right? Well, that's a matter of personal opinion. Which one is the more Jewish one to think? That's a matter of personal opinion. And the book of Esther gives us an opening, right? The reason why, even with all these attempts in Jewish history to, as I called it in the title, cancel the book of Esther, the reason why the book of Esther ended up lasting is because that's the reality of the Jewish community, right? The Jewish community doesn't work like the Septuagint, where you pray to God 1,000,000 times and it suddenly gets done. The Jewish community doesn't work by saying, I'm going to be like the Essenes, and if I don't like, Barbara's view of the world, I'm going to hide it and pretend like it doesn't exist, right? The book of Esther brings all of the diversity of Judaism and also a lot of the imperatives of Judaism. And for all these reasons, I believe that, again, Purim ends up being, right, an extremely fun holiday, right? It's considered, of course, the most fun day of the year, but there's also something much deeper that I think we gain from Purim, right? And sort of the metaphor of Purim is, masking ourselves and realizing that the world is always deeper than what we can see at face value. And I think the deeper lesson to, embed from Esther is, again, that Jews don't need to all believe one thing. There isn't one right way to view events. And that, again, we live in a world where the actions, just like Mordecai's comments to Esther saying, basically, you are set up, right? You have the ability to change the predicament of the Israelites or the Jews, right? We all in our own lives, rather than stepping back and in the Septuagint version saying, God, please bail us out, we need help. We use our, right, as I imagine the original book of Esther was framed, we use our view of godliness and our heritage and our tradition to then ourselves be those moral actors in the world. So happy Purim, everybody. Again, I'm more than happy to